standards by your governments and by your corporates and private entities around the country. But what has become extremely clear over the last 2 years is that most governments around the world have high expectations of what they expect companies to do in reporting their financial information. As long as the rule doesn't apply to me, the government, they all say. Because most governments around the world, while they are responsible for a significant amount of the activity, economic activity in each country, do not report the financial results of the government's operations in any degree of transparent, open manner. And obviously, as you are well aware, the amount of money that governments put into the gross domestic product changes from country to country, but it is huge. It is enormous. The amount of government debt traded on the stock exchanges around the world is something like 20 times the value of the private, or should I say public company, trades around the world. So government debt, in fact, is a huge part of the trades in the marketplace. Maybe not the sort of thing that you and I necessarily invest in personally. We might prefer Google or Microsoft or whatever other company you care to name, which, by the way, go up and go down and then maybe come up again. But of course, governments invest in government bonds, and so do pension funds. And those pension funds are investing in government bonds based on bad government financial information, generally speaking. Oops, sorry, the wrong way. So what can the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board do about that? Well, the Public Sector Accounting Standards Board has as its mandate to take all of the international financial reporting standards and to identify only to what extent they do not work in the public sector, and amend them only for that purpose. So the Public Sector Accounting Standards Board has now got a set of 31 standards which actually parallel all of the IFRS that were in existence at December 2008, and those public sector accounting standards are in place for December 2009. Because we understand that governments around the world are at completely different stages of development in terms of their internal reporting, the vast majority of governments around the world, are on a cash basis of accounting, not an accrual basis. But as you all know, as good accountants, that anybody can make things look good on the cash basis of accounting. It's just a question of delaying a payment for one day, and it's not this year's problem, it's the first day of next year's problem. So cash basis is better than no basis, but it's not as good as an accrual basis. However, recognizing that many governments around the world need help right now in working out how to develop a cash basis of accounting, the IPSASB, the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, you can see why we use an acronym, IPSASB instead of all of that, has got both a cash basis and an accrual basis of accounting. Now, I well understand that your government is one of the more developed governments in its accounting right now, because it uses the IPSASs, the International Public Sector Accounting Standards, with very little change to develop its financial reporting on a cash basis. And you should be proud of that. It's certainly better than many countries. I would suggest, as we talk, that it's not the best yet, but not many countries are at the best yet, so you are still well along the way to having good disclosure from governments. Well, so what do these standards contain? Well, all of the IFRS are there, but also some specific accounting standards that are only relevant in the public sector. And you can see them on the screen. Okay, so that means the Public Sector Board has finished its work. It can go home and it can disband and we can all save money and you can pay less annual subscription to IFAC next year. No, not quite. The Public Sector Board is now thinking about, well, what does it do now that it's got a complete set of accounting standards? Those of you who follow the International Financial Reporting Standards, the IASB's work, may know that they have been struggling for about 8 years to develop a conceptual framework for accounting standards for the private sector. And they have really been struggling. The IPSAS-B has been developing a similar model for the public sector, and it has decided it can't wait for the private sector conceptual framework. It needs a conceptual framework now. It needs to be able to identify what is an asset, what is a liability, when do you record it, in terms of a conceptual framework so they can move ahead and finish its work, because there are clearly some public sector critical projects that have to be worked on that will never be worked on by the IASB out of the UK because they are clearly public sector related. There is also the requirement to maintain the accounting standards. Those of you who've been studying accounting standards for the private sector will remember that the IFRS said, we have done a lot of work, we will now have a moratorium, a quiet period for 2 years. There's two things wrong with that. They didn't have a moratorium, and the 2 years are up. So there are going to be, and there have been, changes to some of the existing accounting standards. IFRS 39 and others, as you all are well aware, are in the process of being changed. And they've also got new accounting standards that they're developing. The new accounting standard on revenue recognition, well, if I didn't already have gray hair, I would have gray hair. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be very difficult, because as an accounting standard, it doesn't actually tell you the answer for your industry that you might be preparing financial statements for or might be auditing today. It's going to be a question of sort of interpreting the principles in that accounting standard to the particulars of a particular client or a particular industry. So certainly the Public Sector Board has work to do. It has to track all of these changes and these new standards being issued by the IFRS or the IASB, and it has to continue work on its public sector specific issues. And then lastly, but by no means least, it has to be a bit more outgoing now about talking about the fact that it has a set of accounting standards and encouraging their use. And I hope I'm not talking too much out of school, but this morning Arnold and I were invited to sit in a meeting with your senior officers and USAID, which is an organization with considerable resources at its disposal. I think we were told that its current annual budget is something like 12 billion US dollars, billion US dollars, and it is intending to invest a significant part of that every year in your country. And one of the things they want to see happen to that money is that it needs to be managed and reported in accordance with the International Public Sector Accounting Standards. And I think you're having ongoing discussions, which it's not my position to talk about right now, but I'm sure you'll be hearing from your membership that this may well have a huge implication for all of you in this room, whatever role you play within the economy of your country. So the communication is not only to people like USAID, who already understand that these standards exist and endorse them, but to governments around the world. If you had asked me 20 years ago, would we ever persuade, without any legal obligation, persuade governments to change their accounting, I would have said, not a chance. But then those of us who were actually doing accounting 20 years ago might have looked at international financial reporting standards and said, well, that's an interesting set of standards produced by a group of people who suggest that they won't use them themselves, they'll just suggest that the rest of the world uses them. Well, we know where that's gone to now. Pretty much all of the world uses international financial reporting standards, and that's not legislated in most countries. It has become legislated in many countries over the last few years just because it became obvious that that was the way to go. But in many cases it was voluntary adoption. Can we get governments to think the same way? Well, if we move from the fact that 10 or 15 years ago there wasn't one country in the world using one government in the world using accrual accounting, to the point where we have about 30 countries adopting accrual basis IPSASs. You can see some of the list up there.